Yeah, to trap or not to trap, right? That is the question. As all often, I was going through some videos and some entries, posts and stuff on Facebook, various game-related channels. I only watch a couple of them. It's usually because somebody I know has posted, and I click over to see, what topic that they were interested in enough to post, and come up with the subject of gratuitous traps. And having, like I said repeatedly, many years or multiple decades of gaming experience as a GM, more often than not, it has been on a number of occasions where I have utilized the concept of the trap and done so far more often than I probably should have. And it got to me thinking, then later, at some point, I switched over to where I never trapped at all. And then I got to be a little more jaded, or a little more, I don't know what's the good word, older. And from there, it just kind of, when it made sense. So there's the three quantifications for traps as I know it. And if you go back and you look at the old school way of doing a lot of things, especially since we were mostly young kids at the time, we were learning this OSR stuff, as it likes to be referred to today. The tendency to utilize overused traps as an encounter tool was common. And sometimes, a lot of times, we didn't make any effort to really give a lot of thought to why the trap was where it was and what purpose did it serve. A lot of our dungeon crawls include various traps and nefarious types. Trap treasure chests and trap doors are the quite common. The pit traps are the traps that are protecting a corridor or a hallway or something like that. And yet, we also trapped a lot of locations like temples and large halls and entryways to such places. The obvious treasure room or treasure trove. You could make an argument, well, that's a good place to have a trap. And that's true. Now, later on, as I started to really pay attention to why traps are constructed and what's their primary purpose, as a security device or as a deterrent to such things. So, like the Moria book from Middle-earth role-playing game Merc, it has a whole chapter in the back on dwarven traps, especially the types found in Moria or any other dwarven citadel or large enough dwarven home, so to speak, to warrant them. And they have a very good reason and mindset when it comes to placement of traps. They're not placed in such a manner where you can accidentally trip over one, so to speak, or set one off because it's in a spot that makes absolutely no real sense. No, the dwarves of Moria use traps quite judiciously to protect as protective measures for an invasion per se. So primary corridors or crucial stairways or crucial junctions where stairways and hallways and passageways meet would be a logical place for a trap. And a lot of times those were tactical or strategic traps in the essence that they weren't left active. They were only activated when the facility, the citadel itself was under attack. They didn't make any sense to leave them so an unwary dwarf might accidentally fall into one or set one off. The next most logical place for these traps were placed in oddly enough, the treasury halls, in the areas around the treasury halls. More importantly, the entranceways leading to them. The idea being was, we don't want you getting our stuff, and we would rather set off a trap. And some of these were quite ingenious traps, and others were just, basic pitfall or deadfall trap, where a chunk of the ceiling drops on your head or the floor drops out from under you and you drop into an X amount of deep pit. And in the case of an underground dwarven city, that could be quite deep and will often lead to other types of hazards, such as, underground lakes and rivers and pits full of rocks and other dead bodies. Just saying. Those were strategically placed on purpose. And plenty of warnings were given to anybody who knew what the warning signs were. If you don't speak Dwarven or Old Dwarvish, perhaps you're going to be at a disadvantage. And it was meant that way on purpose. They don't put up a warning, there's a minefield ahead. They want you to stumble into it because you're in an area you have no business in, where everybody else who lives there knows better than to go to this particular location of this deep or that or that level. Stay away from the treasure hoard, more or less. And if you don't have the knowledge of the traps and the ways to neutralize them so you can pass safely, then you get what's coming to you. So it makes sense at that point. So I started looking at things from that kind of perspective. Why do we trap? And then it comes into another three-tier consideration. We trap because we're protecting a situation or an environment or a specific location or defending against an outside foe. The second type of trap would be the kind of trap that's created by certain types of monsters and beasts and magical creatures and so on and so forth. Like my favorite go-to when it comes to traps, the little almost innocent-seeming kobold. Except kobolds usually run in very large packs, but kobolds have a natural tendency to create traps. So they're going to create your slip knot traps, your drag traps, dropping a homemade set of netting on top of you or a pile of rocks. These are traps that they set up sometime on an impromptu basis, and often to protect the approaches to their lair. And that makes sense. This is large numbers are basically walking rats, and they have a very easy. They're very easy for most, even low-level adventurers to take on and be successful in the dealing with. So having them trap their environment helps protect the nest, which makes perfectly good sense. And there are other beasts that trap as a part of their approach to gathering foodstuffs. So, in a way, and I've had some lively discussions over the years on the subject. The spiders also create traps, and their webbing is a form of a trap. It's set up so you don't notice it until you're in it. Or they dangle sticky threads, and then you run into it and get tangled up, and they haul you up and dispatch you, along with cave fishers and a bunch of other similar type beasts. So these are natural seeming creative traps utilized by the beasties, the monsters, so on and so forth. And these traps can literally be anywhere. Now, most likely, unless this was like an abandoned approach to an abandoned lair, these traps are going to be fairly fresh and new. And as they get older, they're going to deteriorate. They're going to go bad and no longer function. An old cobweb is an old cobweb. It don't have the sticky value that it did when it was first put up. So those giant spiders are trapping a particular area. This is what, you go into old dungeons and you find old cobwebs hanging everywhere. Well, those things pretty much are covered in dust, and they're not going to function the way they're supposed to. The organic material will deteriorate quite rapidly in some environments, so that makes sense. The third category of nescient traps would be the sort of traps you might find outside of a human or other humanoid species, race. Their towns, their villages, their farms, the woodlands in the various vicinities, these are for the most part going to be small nuisance traps. They're using them to trap small game or medium-sized game, because if you've got a bunch of large badgers running around, those things are the size of small bears. You might need a bigger trap. It's the same in the city where you've got large sewer rats running around. There you're going to find a lot of different kinds of traps. These are mostly minor obstacles when it comes to human-sized people. On the other hand, they can also be quite dangerous in the wrong environment. So if you step in a bear trap and you become injured, then you can extract the odds are real good you can get yourself out of a bear trap. But you've already taken that damage, so potentially if you're a long way from help, you better have some healing skills of your own, or a healing potion or two, and you might find yourself in deep depths. And of course, there's a level of immersion and stuff that goes along with these traps that most people don't really want to get into. And I can understand it because it's a long-term thing. But obviously, an old trap potentially baited with wrong kind of material or slathered with nefarious substances or even nefariously smelly byproducts of certain people, then can cause infections and disease and things like this if gone untreated for any length of time. So you got to watch for that. Then humans themselves are nastily inventive when it comes to protecting their territories. You only have to look in recent modern times of the combat in the South, in Southeast Asia as an example of some of the horrific traps that both sides could set for the other. And thousands of years old, but they're effective, which is why they're still in use 1,000 and so years later after the induction of it. It makes sense to me. So when I look at traps today, when I look at setting them out, I've drifted away from the random encounter, the random dungeon encounter, the random world encounter, unless there's a value to it. I mean, obviously, if the group's just chewing its way along and we're traveling some distance and I just want to throw something lively in for the moment, I might grab one of my random encounter charts and toss a die and see what happens. The rare chance that a trap comes up, well, then I have to quickly, in my mind, shoot from the hip, justify why that trap seems to be there. Just out there in the middle of nowhere for no apparent reason. How old is it? How long did it get set? So potentially they could fall into a trap that's so outdated that it just, nothing really comes out of it. It's still an encounter. It still puts them on their toes, so to speak, in case there's more of them. Something that does still work. Or if it's something that's been freshly put, is a trapper running a trap line, for example? Or do we have a nearby lair of kobolds hanging out? Or orcs or goblins or any other humanoids that have tendencies to create traps. Although the more bigger humanoids are less likely to utilize traps than the smaller ones. It's been my experience, or I noticed that sort of. It's that way, which ironically can bring us to another set of whimsical kind of traps. What if you've got a small clan of wood giants or hill giants or whatever living in the region, or cave giants, and they go out and they set small snare traps to catch what they consider small deer and bear people. Yeah. So that little snare trap set up for human size might be much more effective than what we expect it to be. It's just sized up for the giant category of Yahoo who placed it out there. So when I preset a dungeon, or I preset an old keep or a city environment, I asked myself, would there be traps? If there are, why are they there? And I don't just place them willy-nilly. I'm just scattering these random things around just so somebody runs into them. And I don't know about you, but I'll speculate that if you've been playing long enough and you've played with enough people, you've probably run across that one GM who gets a laugh out of these things and just seems to pepper them everywhere. So you walk into basically a minefield of traps, which, if there was a purpose for it, like defending a certain ford or defending a line that could be during a battle or an upcoming battle, I can see that sort of thing. But just putting 20 or 30 traps out in a random field for no apparent reason doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because that's a lot of work, a lot of resources expended for very little payback or no payback. So most intelligence beings are not going to waste their time with that sort of thing. They got more important things to do, like fighting off the local kobolds or raiding the caravans or hunting and gathering or brawling and drinking and more or less being lazy all day. They can get away with it. So why be out there digging pits all day, for no reason? So I have to ask myself, what was the primary reason? Why would they be there? And then I look at the situation and go, okay, well, this makes sense. We're in a shopkeeper's back room. Here's his little office or his sleeping quarters. Here's his money chest. The guy probably may or may not have a trap set up. Then I think, well, what sort of trap would this individual use? What's his alignment? If his or her alignment is, conducive to some pretty nasty stuff, then there's going to be potential for nasty traps. If the goodly alignment people, they're more likely to use non-lethal traps. They're going to set up a trap that's going to stun you or maybe slap something around your wrist and trap you in place. That way they can confront you as to what you're doing in there with your hand in the cookie jar. You're willing to chew your own hand off, that's up to you, but potentially they didn't set out to purposely kill you. They just want to make sure that you don't get into stuff you don't have no business being in. And then that makes good sense to me. I also go and I look at things like, what's the point of the trap? Am I going to want to kill somebody? Is it lethal? Is it meant to capture? If my intention is to capture somebody alive and then later interrogate them as to what they're doing in the area, it would make sense to have a non-lethal trap, or a trap that gives you the lethal option later. And that's something that the trap within a trap, which is one that I experienced as a player from a clever GM some years back, and it got me to utilize these in my own campaigns on a rare occasion. This is where you bumble into a seemingly a lethal trap that turns out to be not so lethal. So you fall down a pit, but the pit drops about 5 feet and then starts to angle enough that you come out of it and you slide to the bottom and you're inside a room with a door. And you can't get out the door because there's no hinges, there's no locks, there's nothing on your side but metal or stone. So you can throw yourself against it and try your strength and stuff. Maybe you'll get lucky. But at some point, the people who run the place show up and with a lot of weapons and backup to extradite you from your trap to find out exactly what it is you've been trying to do and why you decided to visit their facility. And at that point, they judge whether or not you're worthy of saving. So they pull a lever and in comes the water, or in comes the mud, or the ceiling starts to drop slowly and spikes extrude from it. So now yourself are really in a situation, if you can't BS your way out of the trap itself, because obviously you couldn't force yourself physically out of the room, you might just be hosed. Now, there is the one little nasty thing that leaves a lot of bad taste in a lot of people's mouths when it comes to the traps. The fact is, the possibility that we can make a trap that's not going to be escapable, an escape-proof trap, or darn near impossible to get out of a trap. So the average adventuring group, unless they carry some arsenal of magic abilities that might extradite them from that situation, and then as the GM you may have taken that into account and set that sort of trap up just for that very reason, because it forces your resident magic users to expend some of that precious magic of theirs to help get you out of the situation you put yourself in. Or for some nefarious reason, you're getting your kicks out of, eliminating your players. And death is death in the game, and you fell into my death trap. Oh, everybody re-roll characters. We're going to start playing Star Wars tomorrow. See? Sometimes you got to think through that. I've been guilty of that myself once or twice of making too elaborate of a trap, too difficult of a trap for anybody to get out of. And in my twisted logic of my own head, it made perfectly good sense. And then later, I had to apologize to the group because I didn't realize that you guys were not going to be able to get out of this thing, or you're all going to roll real bad. And that's part of the game they fall into. This is ideally why, if you think about it, most traps are not intended to capture the entire party, but just a portion of the party. So if everybody's clumped together in the same 10-foot square, which by rules of D&D combat, the 5-foot square is the standard. So ideally, no more than 2 of the group would be together to get into that trap at the same time. So, the rest are outside helping to figure out how to extradite their friends from the thing that they fell into, or they're becoming tangled with or mangled by, or what have you. But sometimes you just create too much, too elaborate, and it ends up being an utter fail. Not necessarily a good thing, right? That's my opinion on that particular subject. But it's a thought worth investigating. We also have to look at things, well, we don't have to look at anything, to be honest with you. But when it comes to these things, the more elaborate the trap, the more expensive this trap is. The older D&D books, 2nd edition and 3rd edition, I believe, if you look in the section on crafting traps, creating traps, they give you expenses, how much these things cost, how much the kind of material you might need, and how much that might cost, and then the labor to build them, and then possibly the labor needed to eliminate the laborers who built the traps. That way nobody knows who set where it is and how not to set it off, right? Because the more people that know about the trap in the first place, the more likely it is that the secret gets out, and then they're not so good. So having random traps set up in odd locations for no apparent reason is a lot of expense for nothing, and it just doesn't justify just having the random trap. It's the same with the environment. If we look at the environment of the underground, which is where a lot of the traps usually have a tendency to crop up in, is what kind of environment are we looking at? Are we looking at a natural cavern system, a natural kind of, limestone, what have you, created by nature, or something that's been fashioned, been made, dug out of straight solid stone or rock? And why? So obviously the odds of having a trap, a preset, purposely designed trap in, say, a natural occurring cavern is unlikely, unless, of course, that cavern's inhabited by somebody. At that point, well, I guess you could make a point of doing that. I mean, somebody's going to we're back to that lair thing. I'm going to protect my lair or my sanctuary, and I'm going to use traps to help do it, because it means I don't have to sit around here, and I don't have to feed the lions, and I don't have to pay the kobolds, and so on and so forth. But did it make sense in the first place to have it there? I have to often ask myself if I go that route. I know that, like I said, as I've gotten older and wiser, I use them far less often, and mostly judiciously, in such a manner that makes perfectly good sense to me as to why they would be there and how they would be maintained and what their primary purpose is. Because, it's possible for a trap to have multiple purpose, serve multiple, a trap that will obviously capture somebody, and it could be constructed in such a manner to be obvious, and at that point it's going to be utilized as a warning device, per se. Or not. But there you go. There's my thought on traps in general. As always, I'm always interested in hearing if you got something else more to say or add to it. Till next time, watch where you put your wires.